What did it actually cost to survive 24 hours in World War I? A soldier's life in the trenches, through the eyes of the men who lived at WW2 Tales. Think about the last war film you watched. The soldiers look exhausted, sure, but in a handsome, rugged kind of way. Their uniforms are torn but somehow still fitted. They charge across open ground with their rifles up. They die behind cover. They share meaningful glances with their comrades. And when the battle ends, they sit around a fire, smoke a cigarette, maybe share a letter from home. There's grime on their faces, but it's the cinematic kind, the kind that a makeup artist applied with a sponge in a trailer. Now forget all of that, because the reality of what it meant to survive a single day in a First World War trench, not a battle, not a charge, just an ordinary Tuesday in 1916, was something so far removed from anything cinema has ever shown you that it requires a complete mental reset. The men who lived in those trenches didn't suffer only when the shells were falling or when the whistles blew for an advance. They suffered constantly in the quiet moments, in the hours between the violence. They were being destroyed by the environment itself, by the water, by the cold, by creatures so small you couldn't see them without squinting, by sound that never stopped. This video is not about the famous battles. It is not about the generals or the strategies or the maps in the history books. It is about what one ordinary soldier experienced during one ordinary day in the most extraordinary and horrifying living conditions ever endured by human beings in the history of modern warfare. What did it cost to survive 24 hours in a First World War trench? Let's find out. Part 1. What a trench actually was and what it actually looked like. Before we can talk about what happened inside a trench, we need to talk about what a trench actually was. Because the mental image most people carry is wrong in almost every significant detail. When people picture a World War I trench, they tend to imagine something fairly straightforward. A long ditch, maybe 6 feet deep, with sandbag walls on either side. Soldiers standing at the ready, rifles pointing toward enemy lines. Tidy if grim. Functional. A military installation. The reality was something considerably less dignified. The Western Front, the line of trenches stretching from the Belgian coast all the way south through France to the Swiss border, consisted of more than 15,000 kilometers of excavated defensive positions. 15,000 kilometers. Roughly a third of the way around the Earth. And that figure covers just one front, just one theater of an industrial war being fought simultaneously across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific. These trenches were not engineering marvels. They were holes dug by exhausted men under fire, in ground that had never been intended to hold water out, in a climate that spent a significant portion of the year trying to put water in. The Western Front ran through Belgium and northern France, low-lying ground with high water tables, ground that had flooded and drained and flooded again for centuries before anyone thought to dig defensive positions in it. When soldiers dug down into that earth in the autumn of 1914, the water followed them. The standard British trench system was organized into 3 parallel lines. The front line trench faced the enemy directly. This is where soldiers stood guard and where attacks were launched and repelled. Behind it sat the support trench, where reserve troops waited. Behind that, the reserve trench, where resting unit supplies and command posts were located. Connecting all 3 lines were narrow communication trenches, passages just wide enough for a man to walk through if he bent slightly and moved quickly, because standing upright in a communication trench within range of enemy snipers was not something a man did twice. On paper, this system looks organized, logical, military. In practice, by the winter of 1914 and 1915, significant portions of the system were partially submerged in standing water, partially collapsed from artillery strikes, partially filled with mud so thick it could swallow a man to the knee if he stepped wrong. British Private Arthur Pollard described arriving at his assigned trench in late 1914 and finding it half full of water and mud. He and his section set to work trying to drain it. The effort was hampered, he noted, by the fact that the French troops who had previously occupied the position had buried their dead in the bottom and walls of the trench itself. Every stroke of the shovel encountered a body. The smell, he wrote, was indescribable. That trench, that half-flooded, corpse-walled ditch, was his home for the foreseeable future. The trench system had its own internal geography, a miniature world with its own rules. Firing steps, raised platforms of packed earth, allowed soldiers to peer over the parapet without standing fully upright. Sandbags reinforced the walls against bullets and shrapnel. Duckboards, wooden planks laid lengthwise along the trench floor, were supposed to keep soldiers' feet above the standing water, though the boards themselves frequently disappeared into mud or rotted, or were blown apart by nearby strikes. Dugouts, small underground chambers carved into the trench walls, provided sleeping spaces that were slightly more sheltered than the open trench, though they were also dark, cramped, prone to flooding, and occasionally collapsed onto the men sleeping inside them. By the winter of 1914, one British regiment reported that it had spent an entire week trying to pump water out of its assigned trench section, gaining ground by day and losing it again by night as the water table reasserted itself. Another unit reported that after a heavy rain, their front-line position had been reduced to a channel of water roughly chest-deep in places, and that the men had spent 48 hours essentially swimming in place, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to do anything but endure. This was the world. This was the home. And everything that happened inside it, everything a soldier ate, breathed, touched, feared, and slowly became, happened within those few square meters of sodden, stinking, rat-infested earth. The most dangerous hour of the day. In the world outside the trenches, dawn is a peaceful thing. The light comes slowly. Birds start up. The night's chill begins to lift. People wake gradually, reach for tea, think about what the day holds. In the trenches, dawn was the most dangerous hour of the entire 24. Every morning, regardless of weather, regardless of what happened the night before, regardless of how much sleep, or more accurately, how little sleep anyone had managed, the order came down. Stand to. Stand to was the daily ritual of First World War trench life. Every soldier on the front line was required to be on the fire step, the raised platform at the front of the trench, with his rifle ready and his eyes on the enemy line, for the 30 minutes before sunrise and the 30 minutes after it. No exceptions, no exemptions, regardless of whether you had been on overnight sentry duty, regardless of whether you had been out in no man's land working party, regardless of everything. The reason for this ritual was purely tactical and brutally logical. Dawn was the most likely time for an enemy attack. In the gray half-light before full sunrise, visibility was poor enough to mask an advancing force, but sufficient for attackers to move with purpose. If you were going to push men across no man's land with any hope of reaching the enemy wire before being cut down, dawn was your best window. Both sides knew this. Both sides prepared for it in the same way. Every man on the line, every morning, standing ready. Snipers were most active at dawn. Throughout the entire war, the single most common cause of individual casualties in the trenches was not artillery, not gas, not bayonet charges. It was sniper fire during transitional light periods at the beginning and end of each day. Men who had survived months in the trenches were killed by a momentary lapse of caution, raising their heads slightly too high to look over the parapet, lifting a hand above the sandbag line, pausing for just a fraction of a second in the wrong place. A Scottish soldier wrote in a letter home during the winter of 1915, "My mate was talking to me this morning. He turned to look at something, laughed at what he saw, and then simply fell. Nobody heard the shot. Nobody saw where it came from. One moment he was laughing. The next he was gone. I don't laugh in the mornings anymore." When stand ended without incident, which on most mornings it did, the order came, stand down, and the day's other business began. The first task every morning was weapon maintenance. The conditions in the trenches were catastrophically bad for firearms. Mud, water, humidity, and temperature fluctuations conspired to jam, rust, and foul weapons at every opportunity. Each morning, every soldier cleaned his rifle. He checked the bolt action. He cleared the barrel. He applied oil. This was not optional, and it was not ceremonial. A rifle that failed to fire at the wrong moment was not just inconvenient. It was a death sentence. The second task, every morning, was a foot inspection. An officer walked the line, and every soldier was required to remove his boots, as much as removal was possible in the circumstances, and show his feet to the medical officer or his commanding officer. This might sound unnecessarily bureaucratic, almost absurd in the context of everything else happening on the front line of a world war. But the reason for it was deadly serious, and we will come to it very soon. Then, if the supply chain had functioned overnight, and if conditions allowed, came breakfast. Food, what soldiers actually ate and what got to it first. Cinema has a complicated relationship with the food of the First World War. Soldiers in films tend to eat in ways that look vaguely authentic, hunched over tin mess kits, eating quickly, sharing whatever's available. The reality of what was actually in those mess kits, what condition arrived in, and what had been through it before it reached the soldier's hands, is something the camera tends not to linger on. The staple food of the British frontline soldier was something called bully beef. The name derived from the French verb bouillir, boiled beef, and it was exactly what it sounds like: tinned, salted, compressed corned beef that had been processed, sealed, and shipped in enormous quantities from factories in South America and elsewhere, defeating stations across the Western Front. The most common brand was Frey Bentos, produced in Uruguay, and millions of those tins made the journey across the Atlantic and through the supply chain end up opened by a cold, muddy hand in a flooded Belgian trench. Each tin held about 12 ounces of compressed beef and fatty jelly. It did not spoil easily. It provided calories. Beyond those two virtues, its advocates struggled to find many more. Alongside bully beef came the hard biscuit, a cracker of such geological density that soldiers nicknamed it the dog biscuit, and that was not a term of affection. These biscuits were designed for longevity over palatability. They could survive months in a ration pack without deteriorating significantly, which was both their primary virtue and an indication of exactly how little nutrition the manufacturing process had preserved. Most soldiers soaked them in tea before attempting to eat them, not because this was culinary preference, but because biting directly into a dry biscuit risked breaking teeth that had no access to a dentist. Tea was the essential currency of British military morale. It was issued twice daily in most units, sweetened with condensed milk and sugar that arrived pre-mixed from central ration kitchens behind the lines. The ritual of brewing and distributing tea, even in the most appalling conditions, even during artillery bombardments, was maintained with stubbornness that later generations would find either admirable or baffling. For the men in the trenches, it was neither. It was simply necessary. The warmth of a tin cup held between two muddy hands represented, for a few minutes, something that felt like ordinary human life. Jam was distributed regularly, typically plum and apple, the combination so universally present and so universally resented that it became a standing joke across the entire British expeditionary force. Occasionally there was bacon or a stew made from whatever vegetables the supply chain had managed to forward. But fresh food, genuinely fresh food, the kind that had recently been a living plant or animal, was rare to the point of being memorable. Canadian Private Robert Miller wrote in a letter in 1916, "Today I had for breakfast a piece of hard bread and a cup of tea. For lunch, tinned beef. For supper, tinned beef. Same as yesterday. Same as the day before. We all eat the same thing. We all smell the same thing. We all look the same thing." The food that didn't reach the soldiers, meanwhile, was not wasted. The rats got it. The rat population of the Western Front trenches defies easy description. Millions is a conservative estimate, perhaps tens of millions. They inhabited every dugout, every supply dump, every corner and crevice of the trench system, and they were, crucially, enormous. Soldiers regularly reported seeing rats as large as domestic cats. This was not exaggeration or trench mythology. The Western Front provided an essentially unlimited food supply in the form of unburied human remains, discarded rations, organic waste, and the general abundance of an environment that had been thoroughly churned by the most intensive industrial warfare the world had ever seen. Under those conditions, rats did what rats do. They ate and they grew. They were fearless. British Private Thomas McKindow described watching a rat rear up on its hind legs in front of him and simply stare at him, making no attempt to retreat, as he raised his rifle and took aim. They ran across the faces of sleeping soldiers. They chewed through canvas haversacks to reach the food inside. They contaminated water supplies with their droppings and spread diseases including Weil's disease, leptospirosis, which caused jaundice, kidney failure, and death. They were killed by the thousands in nightly rat hunts that became something close to sport, with soldiers using bayonets, shovels, and entrenching tools to reduce the local population. It made no measurable difference. The population simply replenished itself. A French soldier named Ernest Karganoff described his experience in the Champagne trenches this way. We had to suffer from rain, mud, lice, and rats. The trenches were very poor, half destroyed. Our food station was about 3 miles back, and we had to wait every evening for our meals, which came usually cold. The only way we could warm it was to... And then he stopped because there was no reliable way to warm it. Trench foot, when the ground itself became the enemy. Now we come to one of the most important and least glamorized stories of the entire First World War. One that you will almost certainly never have seen depicted accurately in any film or television program about this conflict. One that, when you understand it fully, will fundamentally change the way you think about what these soldiers were actually enduring. Trench foot. In the autumn and winter of 1914, as the trench systems of the Western Front flooded and the British Army's leather ammunition boots, not waterproof, not designed for prolonged immersion, began to fail, soldiers started developing a condition that medical officers initially struggled to classify. Their feet were swelling. They were becoming discolored, first red, then blue, then a mottled, unhealthy gray. They were becoming numb. And when soldiers tried to walk on feet in this condition, they found they couldn't. The mechanism was this. When the feet are kept wet and cold for extended periods, typically 12 hours or more, the blood vessels in the extremities constrict in response to the cold. This constriction reduces blood flow to the tissue, which deprives the cells of oxygen. Without oxygen, the tissue begins to die. It happens slowly, which is part of what makes it so insidious. There is no single dramatic moment of injury, just gradual, quiet cellular destruction that proceeds invisibly inside a boot that the soldier cannot remove. Why couldn't soldiers remove their boots? Because they were under orders not to. Because at any moment, the signal for an attack might come, and a soldier with his boots off was a soldier who could not fight. An officer who permitted his men to remove their boots was an officer who had accepted that his unit would be delayed at the precise moment when delay could cost lives. So boots stayed on, and feet kept dying. The numbers that came out of that first winter are staggering. British forces alone recorded more than 20,000 cases of trench foot between the autumn of 1914 and early 1915. The 48th Division reported in December 1914 that its trench foot casualties exceeded its battle casualties by a ratio of 3 to 1. 3 men were being taken out of line by a preventable foot condition for every 1 man being taken out by enemy action. By the end of the war, approximately 74,000 British soldiers had been evacuated from the front with trench foot, not dead, but removed from fighting capability for weeks or months. In American forces alone, roughly 2,000 additional cases were recorded. What did advanced trench foot actually look like? The progression was documented in terrible detail by medical officers throughout the war. In the early stages, the feet swelled. Blisters formed along the soles and between the toes. Walking became painful, then agonizing. Then, and this is the part that deceived many soldiers into thinking they were improving when they were not, the pain stopped. The feet went numb. The circulation had been so thoroughly compromised that the nerve endings had ceased to function. This numbness was not relief. It was the tissue dying. If the soldier at this point could be evacuated and his feet could be dried and warmed, there was a reasonable chance of recovery, though even mild cases required 4 to 6 weeks before he could return to duty. But if the condition had progressed, if the tissue had died thoroughly enough, gangrene set in. Gangrene is the infection and decay of dead tissue. It smells. It spreads. And once it has established itself in a foot or a leg, the only intervention available in 1914 or 1915, with any real chance of saving the soldier's life, was amputation. Second Lieutenant George Copped, writing about an incident at a field hospital near Arras in 1916, described watching a nurse attempt to remove a fellow soldier's socks. He wept uncontrollably, Copped wrote, not from the pain of removal, but from terror of what might be revealed. What was revealed when the socks finally came off, after days of continuous immersion, after the foot had swollen and the sock had essentially fused the skin, was something that Copped, a man who had seen considerable combat, described as difficult to look at directly. The British military's eventual response to this crisis was a combination of compulsion and innovation. From 1915 onward, Every soldier was required to perform twice daily foot inspections, apply whale oil to his feet and boots as a moisture barrier, and change his socks as frequently as supply permitted. Commanding officers were held personally responsible for the trench foot rates in their units, a recognition that the problem was systemic and preventable rather than simply an inevitable consequence of war. Units with high trench foot rates had their officers called to account. The whale oil treatment was unglamorous, time-consuming, and critically effective. It worked by creating a barrier between the skin and the wet environment that the boot could not. A dry pair of socks, delivered to the front by an efficient supply chain, was not a comfort item. It was a medical intervention. It was, in the most literal possible sense, keeping men alive. A single dry pair of socks. That was the difference between a soldier who remained in a line and one who left it minus a foot. Think about that the next time you put on clean socks in a warm room. The lice, an infestation that never ended. We need to talk about something that no war film will ever fully commit to depicting, not because it is violent or morally complex, but because it is simply too unpleasant, too intimate, and too relentless to make for comfortable viewing. In the trenches of the First World War, virtually every soldier had lice. Not some soldiers. Not soldiers in the worst affected areas. The estimate most historians now accept is that approximately 97% of all officers and men who served in the front-line trenches were infested with body lice. 97%. When nearly the entire population of a defined space carries the same parasite, it stops being an infestation and becomes simply part of the environment. Understanding why this happened requires understanding what the trenches actually provided for a louse. Body lice, Pediculus humanus corporis, are parasites that live specifically in clothing, not on the skin itself. They feed on blood by piercing the skin to drink, but they live, breed, and lay their eggs in the warmth and shelter of fabric, specifically in the seams. The seam of a shirt or a pair of trousers is an ideal louse habitat. Warm from body heat, shelter from wind and light, difficult to reach and inspect. A female louse produces between 8 and 10 eggs per day. Those eggs hatch within 1 to 2 weeks under warm conditions. The immature lice reach breeding age within another 10 days. In the trenches, where soldiers wore the same clothing for weeks without washing it, where they slept pressed against each other for warmth, where the environment made thorough cleaning essentially impossible, a louse population could establish itself and grow to staggering size within a very short time. And once established, it was nearly impossible to fully eliminate. What did it feel like? Multiple soldiers described the experience in consistent terms. The lice were visible, pale fawn in color, about the size of a grain of rice. They moved through the clothing constantly. They fed through the day and night. The bites left blotchy red marks across the entire body, chest, back, armpits, groin, anywhere the clothing made contact with the skin. The itching was constant and severe. Soldiers scratched until their skin bled, which created open wounds that then became secondarily infected. Harry Patch, one of the last surviving veterans of the First World War, described the experience in his memoir with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who had long since made peace with something he could not change. The lice were the size of grains of rice, each with its own bite, each with its own itch. We all got lice in our clothes. We used to run the seam of the shirt over a candle flame to get rid of them. Of course, you'd wash your shirt if you could, and when you did wash it, you'd hang it on a bit of line. Next thing you'd see was the lice crawling along the line. They crawled along the washing line. As fast as you could remove them from the clothing, they made their way back. George Copper described the practice of using a candle flame on the seams in more vivid detail. The things lay in the seams of trousers, in the deep furrows of long, thick, woolly pants, and seemed impregnable in their deep entrenchments. A lighted candle applied where they were thickest made them pop like Chinese crackers. After a session of this, my face would be covered with small blood spots from extra big fellows which had popped too vigorously. They popped. When the flame hit a louse that had recently fed and was full of blood, it detonated with an audible crack, and the blood spattered outward. Coppett's face would be dotted with the blood of the parasites he had just executed. This was considered a reasonable evening's work. This was a normal part of the routine. This practice of sitting together and picking lice from clothing and from each other's bodies became known as chatting. The term is the origin of our modern English verb to chat, meaning to talk casually and sociably. When British soldiers needed to perform their daily delousing, they sat together in groups and talked while they worked. The association between the activity and the conversation became strong enough that the word survived the activity by a century. The physical consequences of lice went beyond the discomfort of constant itching and the indignity of being permanently infested. Lice were the vector for a disease called trench fever, caused by the bacterium Bartonella quintana, which the lice spread through the broken skin of their bites. Trench fever caused high fever, severe joint and muscle pain, intense headaches, and profound fatigue. The fever would break after 5 or 6 days and then return. The cycle could repeat as many as 8 times before the patient recovered. Average time out of the line for a trench fever case, 3 months. Among British, French, and Belgian soldiers combined, the best estimates placed the total number of trench fever cases between 1915 and 1918 at close to 500,000 casualties from a disease carried by a parasite the size of a grain of rice. Behind the lines, delousing stations existed, facilities where uniforms were steamed and soldiers were scrubbed. They were available approximately every 2 weeks for soldiers who could be rotated back. 2 weeks. That is the interval between opportunities for basic hygiene in an environment where the reinfestation period after delousing was measured in hours, not days. Soldiers who returned to the front with clean uniforms were reinfested before they reached their positions. The lice were not beaten. Not in 1914, not in 1915, not in 1918. They were simply endured, as everything else in the trenches was endured, with whatever combination of grim humor, practical ingenuity, and sheer exhausted resignation a man could manage. The sound that never stopped, artillery, and what it did to the mind. Here we come to what many veterans, decades after the war, described as the worst thing, not the worst danger, not the worst physical suffering. The worst thing about living in the trenches, the thing that appeared in their nightmares for the rest of their lives, the thing that, for many, never fully stopped. The sound. Artillery was the dominant weapon of the First World War in terms of casualties caused and psychological impact created. The German army alone fielded thousands of guns along the Western Front. The British and French had comparable numbers. These guns fired constantly, not continuously in the way a machine gun fires, but regularly, throughout the day and much of the night, in barges that could last minutes or hours or days depending on what the operational situation demanded. Each artillery shell in flight makes a distinct sound, a whistle or shriek in the air, rising in pitch as it approaches. Experienced soldiers could sometimes gauge in the sound whether an incoming round was likely to land nearby or further away. They never knew for certain, and the uncertainty was a thing. Every time you heard that sound, you had perhaps 2 seconds to decide whether to flatten yourself against a trench wall, dive into a dugout, or continue standing. And a decision had to be made before the information that would have justified it was available. This is what sustained artillery bombardment does to the human nervous system over days and weeks and months. It creates a state of permanent, unresolvable vigilance. The threat is always real. The response required is always immediate. But the threat arrives randomly, and the vigilance must be maintained continuously. During major offensives, preliminary artillery bombardments lasted not minutes, but days. The bombardment before the Battle of the Somme in July 1916 lasted 7 days. Over those 7 days, the British Army fired more than 1.5 million shells at German positions. For 7 days and 7 nights, the ground shook continuously. The sound was audible in southern England across the Channel. In the trenches directly beneath that bombardment, men who had been ordered to hold their positions, because the advance was coming and they needed to be ready, experienced something that no human being had ever previously encountered in quite that concentrated form. 168 consecutive hours of industrial-scale explosive sound, delivered with enough force to feel each impact as a physical blow through the earth. Men could not sleep. Men who had not slept for 48 hours under bombardment began to hallucinate. They heard voices in the shells. They saw movement where there was none. They lost track of time entirely. Soldiers who had been in a bombardment for 2 days sometimes could not accurately state whether it had been hours or weeks. Their sense of the past and future collapsed into an endless, undifferentiated present of noise and concussion, and the simple project of survival in the next 10 seconds. Canadian military historian Tim Cook documented cases of soldiers who, after extended bombardments, were found sitting in their dugouts completely unresponsive, eyes open, breathing, showing no physical wounds, but unable to speak, unable to follow orders, unable to function in any way. When addressed, they gave no indication of having heard. When physically moved, they did not resist but also did not cooperate. They were simply absent from the situation their bodies remained in. And this brings us to the condition that became, in many ways, the defining invisible wound of the First World War. Shell shock, the wound that couldn't be seen. In 1915, a British psychologist named Charles Samuel Myers published a paper in The Lancet, one of the world's leading medical journals, in which he described a cluster of symptoms he was observing in soldiers returned from the front. He called the condition shell shock, and the term immediately captured something that military medicine had been struggling to name. The symptoms Myers documented were diverse and, from the perspective of the medicine of the time, deeply confusing. Some soldiers had lost the ability to speak, not through damage to their throat or vocal cords, but through some process that had shut down the neurological pathway between intention and speech. They knew what they wanted to say. They opened their mouths. Nothing came out. Others had lost the use of their legs, not through spinal injury or muscle damage, but through the same mysterious functional shutdown. They could feel their legs. They could see them. They simply could not make them move. Still others had gone deaf or blind or both, again, without any identifiable physical damage to the relevant organs. Alongside these physical manifestations were the psychological ones. Uncontrollable tremors that could affect the hands, the jaw, the entire body. Extreme and irrational fear responses to sounds or movements that did not represent real threats. Total inability to sleep. Nightmares so severe that soldiers dreaded losing consciousness. Emotional instability. Men who had demonstrated courage under fire breaking down, without warning, into inconsolable weeping, without knowing why or being able to stop. The initial response of the British military establishment to shell shock was not compassionate. The official position, maintained with varying degrees of rigidity throughout the war, was that shell shock represented a failure of character, a moral weakness, a want of courage and self-control that a fighting man was expected to possess. Soldiers diagnosed with shell shock were often returned to the front after minimal rest, on the grounds that they were physically uninjured and therefore available for duty. Some were court-martialed. During the war, the British Army executed 306 soldiers for offenses including cowardice and desertion. A significant proportion of these men, the exact number cannot now be determined, were almost certainly suffering from what we would today diagnose as severe combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder. What was actually happening in the bodies and minds of these men? The human nervous system is built for threat response. When we perceive danger, the body releases adrenaline and cortisol, raises a heart rate, directs blood flow to muscles, and prepares the organism for fight or flight. This system is extraordinarily effective for the threats it evolved to handle: a predator, an aggressor, a physical danger that can be confronted or escaped. But it was never designed to operate continuously for weeks and months. It was never designed to process an environment where the threat is omnipresent, where it can arrive without warning from any direction at any time, where flight is not an option, and where the correct response in any given moment, stand still, flatten yourself, run, return fire, cannot be determined until after the critical window has passed. Under those conditions, sustained for long enough, the system breaks. Not through weakness, not through moral failure, through the simple mechanical reality that a system designed for episodic acute stress cannot indefinitely sustain a state of continuous activation. The tremors, the paralysis, the dissociation, the loss of speech, these were the body's catastrophic attempts to discharge an overload it was never built to carry. One estimate, cited by the historian John Keegan, is that at least 20% of frontline soldiers developed shell shock symptoms during the course of the war. 1 in 5. 80,000 official cases in British forces alone, a figure that almost certainly represents a significant undercount, given the stigma attached to the diagnosis and the military's disincentive to acknowledge the problem at the scale it actually existed. A French officer wrote in 1917 of a soldier brought to his aid station following a sustained bombardment. He had been in the forward position for 11 days. He had not slept in what he believed to be a week, though he had lost reliable track of time. When I spoke to him, he looked at me but gave no indication of comprehension. When I touched his shoulder, he flinched violently and covered his head with his arms. He was not wounded. His body was entirely intact. But he was, for all practical purposes, no longer present. The soldier recovered, partially, after several weeks of rest. He was returned to the line. He survived the war. He never, by his own account in a post-war interview, fully stopped hearing the shells, the weight of what wasn't said. We need a pause here, because amidst all the physical suffering, the water and the lice and the rats and the artillery, there's a dimension of the trench experience that is hard to quantify, but no less real. The interior life of the men who lived there, the weight of what they carried that had nothing to do with their equipment. The British Army delivered approximately 2 billion items of mail during the course of the First World War. 2 billion. Letters, parcels, newspapers, packages of food from home. The postal system that sustained this delivery was one of the most genuinely impressive logistical achievements of the entire conflict. Not the munitions convoys, not the troop movements, but the mail, because the mail was understood at every level from the private soldier to the senior command to be essential to morale in a way that could not be substituted. A letter from home was a thing of extraordinary power in that environment. It was a tangible connection to a world that, after weeks in the trenches, had begun to feel almost fictional. The mundane details of civilian life, a mother writing about the garden, a wife describing the neighbors, a sister complaining about school, were read and reread with an intensity that those writers could not have imagined. A soldier might carry a letter from home folded in his breast pocket for weeks, pulling it out during quiet moments and reading it again not because he had forgotten its contents, but because the act of reading it, of holding something that had been touched by familiar hands in a familiar place, was a form of psychological sustenance. What soldiers wrote home, however, was not always the truth. The British Army's postal censorship system, in which letters were routinely read by officers before dispatch, ensured that soldiers could not describe operational details, troop positions, or planned movements. But many soldiers went further than the censorship required, editing their letters not to protect military secrets, but to protect their families. They wrote of being a bit tired, when they meant they had not slept in 4 days. They described their situation as not too bad, when they meant the man next to them had been killed that morning. They reassured mothers and wives and sweethearts that everything was fine, that they were managing, that they would be home before long. A Scottish soldier named James Morrison, who died at the Somme in November 1916 at the age of 21, wrote to his sister in his final letter home, "I cannot describe this place to you. If I told you, you would not believe me. And if you believe me, you would not sleep. So I will tell you only this. Think of me and wait for me." His sister kept the letter for 60 years. Religion became important to men for whom it had previously been a formality. The presence of chaplains at the front, padres, as they were universally known, was a genuine source of comfort to a significant proportion of soldiers, not necessarily through formal theological engagement, but through the simple human reality of having someone to talk to who was there by choice and whose job was to listen rather than to command. Men who had attended church as a Sunday habit before the war found themselves praying with genuine intensity in ways that surprised them. Men who had considered themselves atheists found the question becoming genuinely open in an environment where the margin between existence and non-existence was narrow enough to become philosophically urgent. Humor, the specifically dark, self-mocking, institutionally irreverent humor that British soldiers in particular deployed as a coping mechanism, was everywhere. The Wipers Times was a satirical newspaper produced by British soldiers in the ruins of Ypres, using a printing press they had found in a bombed building. It ran during 1916 and 1917 and contained poems, jokes, mock advertisements. Lonely Hearts. Mature officer seeks peaceful frontline posting, previous experience of Mudden Advantage, and parodies of the official military communications that governed their lives. Reading it now, a century later, the humor still lands, and its landing is a reminder that the men who made it were fully human, fully intelligent, and dealing with their circumstances in exactly the way that human beings have always dealt with absurd and impossible situations, which is to point at the absurdity and laugh at it. the busiest and most terrifying hours. When darkness fell over the Western Front, the war did not pause. It changed during daylight, movement in no man's land. The strip of ground between the two front lines, anywhere from 15 meters to several hundred meters wide depending on location, was essentially impossible. Anyone who attempted it was visible to enemy snipers and exposed to enemy fire. The day was therefore a period of constrained activity. Maintenance of positions, weapons cleaning, attempted rest, the slow, grinding work of keeping the trench system functional. Night was different. Night was when the trench system came alive with a particular kind of frantic, exhausted, dangerous activity. Working parties went out into no man's land under cover darkness to repair the barbed wire entanglements that defended the front line, while it was constantly being damaged by artillery and that needed constant renewal. These parties moved in near total silence, because sound carried in the quiet of the night in ways it did not during the day's ambient noise. The work was done by feel as much as by sight. A man crawling through the dark carrying coils of barbed wire, trying not to let the wire rattle, trying not to cough, trying not to breathe audibly, making his way by the occasional flare that one side or the other would fire to illuminate the ground. This was routine frontline service. This happened every night. Raiding parties were organized for specific tactical purposes, capturing prisoners who could be interrogated for intelligence, destroying enemy dugouts, disrupting enemy preparations. A raid typically involved between 5 and 30 men, moving through the dark toward the enemy trenches, entering them if possible, creating maximum damage and confusion in minimum time, and withdrawing before coordinated response could be organized. These raids were conducted with bayonets and clubs and knives rather than firearms. A rifle shot would compromise the raiders' position before they had accomplished their objective. The sentry system that operated through the night required every soldier on the front line to stand watch in rotation, typically in 2-hour shifts. The sentry stood on the fire step and stared into the darkness of no man's land, watching for movement, listening for sound, responsible for raising the alarm if anything suggested that an enemy approach was underway. Falling asleep on sentry duty was a court-martial offense. The penalty could be death. In practice, it rarely was, but the threat was real and the stakes were understood. Men who had been awake for 30 or 36 hours still stood their 2-hour watch, sustaining consciousness through whatever means were available, pinching themselves, scratching the trench wall, quietly talking to the soldier on the adjacent position, using cold and discomfort as an alarm system. The flares that went up periodically from both sides created a strange, pulsing experience of near daylight followed by darkness. When a flare went up, every man in no man's land, every raiding party, every wire repair crew, every individual soldier who had moved outside his trench for any reason froze. Instantly, completely, because movement caught in the light of a flare was visible from hundreds of meters away. Experienced soldiers learned to drop where they were, face down, and become part of the landscape for the duration of the flare's light, however long it lasted. Then darkness again. Then movement resumed. The randomness of night activity, the uncertainty about whether a sound in the dark was an enemy raiding party or a stray animal or a fellow soldier who had lost his bearings, created its own form of sustained psychological pressure. Every noise required assessment. Every shadow required interpretation. The night, which might have offered some respite from the visual intensity of the day's threat environment, instead offered a different and in some ways more nerve-wracking set of demands. German veteran Ernst Jünger, who served throughout the war and wrote about it in his memoir Storm of Steel, described the night watches with precision that has made his account one of the most vivid records of what this experience was actually like. We lay in the darkness and listened to nothing, and to nothing, and to nothing, and then to a sound that might have been something, and then to nothing again. The nothing was worse than the something. The something, at least, had a shape, what the 24 hours actually cost. Let's put together now. Let's take an ordinary day. Not a battle day, not the day of a major offensive or a gas attack, or a trench raid that went catastrophically wrong. Just a routine day. A day in, say, the autumn of 1916 on a moderately active section of the British front. You are woken, if you were ever fully asleep, by the stand order before dawn. You have slept perhaps 2 hours in 45-minute stretches on a fire step or in a dugout barely large enough to contain you, with artillery impact shaking the ground at irregular intervals and rats moving across the floor beside your head. You rise. You are wearing the same clothes you have worn for 9 days. Your boots have not come off in 3 days. On orders, your body is covered in louse bites. You scratch at them reflexively, without noticing anymore. You stand on the fire step with your rifle for 30 minutes of stand to. The morning is cold. Mist lies over no man's land. Nothing happens. Stand down comes. You clean your rifle. You show your feet to the section officer, who nods without comment and moves on to the next man. You rub whale oil into your feet before pulling your socks back on. The socks that are damp from yesterday and the day before, but drier than they would have been without the oil. You eat breakfast, a biscuit soaked in tea, and a third of a tin of bully beef. The tin was opened yesterday and has been sitting since. It tastes of nothing and smells of tin. You eat it. Through the morning, you carry out the trench's maintenance requirements, filling sandbags where the parapet has slumped overnight, laying new duckboard sections where the old ones have sunk, carrying ammunition boxes from the supply point 200 meters back through a communication trench that floods every time it rains, which it has done repeatedly. You move bent double for most of this journey, because the communication trench is too shallow in places, and straightening up brings your head above the parapet line. In the afternoon, there is a 2-hour bombardment from the German side, not intense enough to suggest an impending attack, just maintenance fire, the way you might run an engine periodically to keep it from seizing. You flatten yourself in the dugout for the duration, listening to the successive impacts, feeling the ground shake, calculating from the sound of each shell whether it is getting closer or moving away. 2 men in your platoon are wounded, not by direct strikes, but by shrapnel from near misses. They are helped back through the communication trench to the aid station. You watch them go. You do not know if you will see them again. Evening comes. Another tin of bully beef. A piece of bread that arrived this morning and has been distributed in thirds. A cup of tea. Someone has managed to maintain a spirit stove far enough back in the front that the light doesn't create a target, and the tea is actually hot. This feels like an almost miraculous luxury. You cup your hands around the tin and hold it longer than you need to, just for the warmth. Tonight you have sentry duty from 2 to 4 in the morning. Before that, you have time to sit. You open the letter that arrived yesterday from your mother 3 weeks after she wrote it, and read it again in the dim light of a carefully shielded candle. She writes about the garden. The neighbor's boy came home on leave and looks well. She has sent a parcel of tobacco and biscuits, but you haven't received it yet, which probably means it's somewhere in the supply chain. You read it twice, fold it with care, and put it back in your breast pocket. You sit with your section and talk. Someone tells a joke about the rations. Someone else describes a rat he saw yesterday that he swears was the size of a terrier. There is laughter, genuine laughter, then quiet again. At some point in the evening, you take off your shirt and run the seam over a candle flame. The lice pop. You put the shirt back on. At 2 in the morning, someone shakes you awake, and you take your position on the fire step. You stare into the darkness of no man's land for 2 hours. Nothing happens. At 4 in the morning, you are relieved. You sit down with your back against the trench wall and close your eyes. Before you lose consciousness, you hear, distantly, the beginning of an artillery barrage from somewhere to the north. Someone else's problem, tonight. You sleep for 45 minutes before the stand order brings you back to the fire step. And then the day begins again. All of this, is what it costs to survive 24 hours in a First World War trench. Not a heroic charge. Not a dramatic last stand. Just a Tuesday. Just the baseline of what existing in that place, in that time, required of the human body and the human mind. The men who endured it, for months, for years, for the duration of a war that lasted 4 years and 3 months and consumed the lives of around 20 million people, were not superhuman. They were not built differently from us. They were young men from farms and factories and offices and universities who had been placed in circumstances that no previous generation had faced in quite that form, and who found, day after day after day, that they could keep going. Some of them couldn't, and we should remember those ones too. But most of them kept going, through the water and the rats and the lice and the shells and the sleep deprivation and the constant grinding, intimate proximity of death. They kept going because the men beside them kept going, because stopping was not an option, because somewhere back home, someone was waiting for a letter. They kept going, and we should know what that cost them. If this episode gave you something to think about, if it brought those men a little closer to real for you, please take a moment and leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel more than you'd imagine. Subscribe to WW2 Tales if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We tell these stories because they matter, not the polished, cinematic version, the real one, the one with the lice and the cold bully beef and the letter read twice by candlelight, the real men who were real and who deserve to be remembered as such. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you knew about trench life before this video and what surprised you. And if there's a story from a First or Second World War that you think deserves this kind of attention, a story that isn't getting told the way it should be, put it in the comments. Some of our best episodes have come from exactly that. Thank you for watching.